Hello, my name is Paul Worthington. I'm the Director of Research and Development for Lindamood-Bell. Thanks for joining in on this webinar, Empowering Students to Overcome Learning and Attention Challenges. A little bit about the agenda. We're going to talk about some insights into the relationship between learning profiles, both in terms of diagnosis and interventions, and address those as related to attentional issues. We're going to chat quite a bit about effective approaches to address learning and attentional challenges, including some longitudinal data on the outcomes that we've experienced in working with students within this population. I'm going to spend some time, just a little metaphor on the chicken or the egg paradox. When we're talking about, fundamentally what I'm going to be talking about is when students have both learning challenges as well as attentional issues, what's the relationship to those, and is one more predictive to the other? We'll discuss that in some detail as we go on through this. Most importantly, while we're going to be looking at a lot of data and some research relative to the needs of children who fall into this category, Nancy wants us to understand, and justifiably so, that data isn't about numbers, it's about changing lives, which is fundamentally what we're about here at Lindamood-Bell Learning Process. So let's go. If we're empowering students, let's talk about the incidence of individuals with co-occurring learning disabilities and attentional factors. Well, it's well documented, yet the science behind differential diagnosis and customized interventions remains less clear. Hopefully it'll be a little more clear when we wade into what this all means. I think everybody would agree that it's not a new crisis. Learning to read and comprehend serves as a foundation for all educational pursuits and indeed for economic success. We know that millions of people fall into this category, yet 15% of the school population in America, about 7.2 million students, qualify for special education. 85% of those students have a primary learning disability in reading and/or processing language. And the most common learning disability is dyslexia, if we're looking specifically in the language processing profile area. Moreover, 1 in 54 children, now talking about the flip side of this issue, are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders. That's in the United States, many with significant parallel reading disorders. 20% of the world population are affected by learning disabilities if we're looking worldwide. And with a world population of about 8 billion, approximately 1.5 billion of those experience a learning disability. In other words, this is a profound issue, looking both in terms of learning challenges as well as such things as autism, and now relative to attention-based learning issues. ADHD belongs to one of the most common neurobiological childhood disorders and at about 5.3%. According to the NIH, it's estimated that from as much of 20 to 60% of individuals are affected with ADHD, also present with learning disabilities. So we're beginning to look at this chicken or the egg issue on the relationship between these two difficulties. In medical terms, just to borrow, it's not a very friendly word, but in medical terms, it's perhaps best referred to as comorbidity, which is the simultaneous presence of 2 or more chronic diseases or conditions, if you want to put it in the context of learning in an individual. So what do we learn about it? Comorbidity between ADHD and learning disabilities is actually pretty well documented. They often occur together due to shared genetic and neuropsychological factors, with children having both conditions typically exhibiting severe academic and social impairments as compared to those with either condition alone. And what's interesting about that, I mean, the statistics vary, but they're still significant. If we look at the population of comorbidity rates somewhere between 35 and 45% on these particular difficulties. This overlap is particularly prominent in reading disabilities, which of course are the most common research subtypes of learning disabilities associated with ADHD. We're going to get into what that looks like from an intervention standpoint, but it's important to understand the relationship of these from both a diagnostic as well as a remediation standpoint. I think everybody would understand that these are highly heritable neurodevelopmental disorders. Continuing with the NIH, it indicates that both disorders co-occur with high frequency of children meeting the criteria for ASD, and 30 to 80% of autistic spectrum disorders meeting the criteria also for attentional factors or ADHD. So more on this overlap. There's a study done by Francis et al. Two of the most common neurodevelopmental conditions, ASD, autism characterized by social communication difficulties, repetitive and restrictive behaviors, and ADHD with its associated characteristics affect 6 to 14% of the population. This co-occurrence of autism and ADHD have only been permissible since 2013. What it says further is that this dual diagnosis has been possible. It's currently possible, and research therefore is typically focused previously on each condition separately, but we know they're not separate. Frequently they are co-located with each other in the lives of children without fully investigating the trans-diagnostic processes. I want to talk about that a little bit to look at now understanding the diagnostic processes to really ferret out what's going on between learning disabilities and attentional factors for individuals. So despite high comorbidity rates, many individuals diagnosed with ADHD do not undergo comprehensive psychoeducational assessments to identify potential learning disabilities. Here's kind of the scary part. This gap in diagnosis can lead to inadequate treatment plans that do not address all aspects of individuals' difficulties. Studies indicate that significant portions of children with ADHD are not evaluated for coexisting learning disabilities. What does that mean? That means that if a child is diagnosed with ADHD and their learning profile is not checked, there's not only the possibility, but the probability that children could be medicated without having also looked at their learning profile. In fact, some studies highlight that nearly half of the children with ADHD have not been assessed for learning disability despite substantial overlap in symptoms. For example, talking about medications, stimulant medications like methylphenidate are commonly prescribed for ADHD and can improve attention and behavior if that's solely the case, but they do not directly address learning disabilities. This suggests that many children may receive medications for ADHD without an evaluation of educational needs, leading to potential misdiagnosis or incomplete diagnosis might be a better way to put it, not to mention that over-reliance on pharmaceutical treatment without addressing underlying learning disabilities. We have, at Lindamood-Bell, been looking at this literally for years because we take careful attention in looking at the profile of students who are coming into Lindamood-Bell. We have been tracking the profiles of children who have ADHD as they enter into a relationship with Lindamood-Bell, predominantly because they have language-based issues on their learning profile, which is our area of specialization. But out of necessity, because the incidence of learning disabilities and for those children also having attentional issues, we wind up with inheriting those children. So it's important from us in terms of quality instruction to address the needs of those populations of children. when we look at the reading side of this comorbidity issue, what you see, and for those of you who are familiar with Lindamood-Bell, this is our basic reading paradigm, our cognitive learning and language intervention model, where we're looking at the aggregate of the needs of children who have learning issues across the board, strictly on the learning side of issue. We refer to those as sensory cognitive functions that underlie the component parts of reading. And it's important to be able to do this transdiagnostic process, and first of all, looking at the learning profile of children in all those areas that are associated with good reading, in terms of their phonological processing, their orthographic awareness, their overall ability to comprehend, based on the subtraits of being able to image what it is that they're reading, all ending up with good contextual reading and fluency with comprehension. We have ways to measure all that, and once that's done, then it's important to take a look at it in terms of an intervention standpoint. If you're familiar with Lindamood-Bell, to address the needs of the profile of children that we see diagnostically, we use for decoding the Seeing Stars program, visualizing and verbalizing. And I'm going to show you some data here on how we compartmentalize that, because we see kids who have singular issues in these areas or some combination of those for children who are the children that we address in terms of their learning profile. I want to ask you to think about this, starting with what we call poor symbol imagery, or the needs that sensory cognitive needs that children have with regard to being able to decode. Kids who are dyslexic might be in this population. What I'd like to ask you to think about is, if you have a child who can't perform these particular functions, or they show up as having difficulties, what is that going to do to their attentional behavior when they're asked to read, when they're looking at a word for the first time, as in word attack? Or if we skip down to, and in fact, we do diagnose that they have weak phonological and or orthographic processing skills, difficulty reading fluency. If a child's asked to read in class, are they going to be able to attend appropriately to that? We're diving into that chicken or the egg issue. And if they have difficulty monitoring and self-correcting their reading and spelling errors, are they going to want to read? Are they going to be comfortable with wanting to read? And of course, if it's a severe issue, they may have a diagnosis of dyslexia. If we think about it in terms of language comprehension, where the sensory cognitive skill is trying to stimulate what we call their concept imagery, where kids are only getting part of what they read and or hear, and if they're having to reread paragraphs, they have no decoding issues, but they have to reread information. What's that going to do to their attentional factors? And you see that laundry list of many of the symptoms that correspond to children who have no decoding issues. They have difficulty with oral and written language, short, maybe long-term memory. And of course, the question is, what's going to happen when it is that they need to address their language processing from an attentional factor? So what is required in reading, and when is attention concerned? In this study, it's just a quick quote, and I've highlighted on what's going on in school to make the point a little bit further. The importance of sustained attention for learning has been demonstrated in studies that show an association between students, their sustained attention capacity, and academic achievements. Here you're hitting this attentional factor, and what we see, as I'm going to show you shortly, is the comorbidity issue in the data that I referred to earlier in terms of our 15 years of data in looking at this. We see on the symptoms and diagnosis that ADHD may be associated with serious consequences for affected individuals, not only their individuals, but their families, society at large, with symptoms persisting across multiple settings, at home, obviously in school, and elsewhere. I'm going to introduce a vocabulary term, but we need to talk about, just in reference to make sure we're getting a comprehensive picture here, this paleometry. paleopathy, so the genetics on this paleotropy is defined as an expression of multiple traits by a single gene. What we know, just in passing, to understand is that it's not uncommon. In fact, it is the fact, it is an artifact of genetic studies that these characteristics are found in combination with traits, genetically speaking. So it's not just an environmental issue, it's an artifact of students having been born with predispositions in these areas. So, within now the population, having looked at these national larger statistics, what does it look like within the population that we're trying to address students who fall into this category? Again, so from an instructional standpoint, what we're after is at a sensory level to discover what their issue is. The goal being, if we can move from an intervention standpoint to the point where they can begin to monitor whether or not what they're reading, either from a decoding standpoint or whether or not they're understanding what they read, to the extent that they can do that, is to the same extent that they can begin to self-correct when they catch themselves making a decoding error, when they catch themselves not understanding what they read, and they stop and conceptualize what it is that they've just read. To the extent that they can do that is to the same extent then they're going to achieve some level of independence. That's our goal from a clinical standpoint, from an intervention standpoint, is to develop autonomy for students. But there's more to it. If we think about what's going on the effect of not being able to go through this, especially as related to children who also have attentional factors, they have difficulty self-regulating. They have difficulty in terms of their perception of themselves. They have difficulty on through life in self-determination because all of their language processing, their attentional factors, to the extent that those fall in line or fall online, however you want to say it, is to the same extent that children are going to be productive members of society. These are important considerations. As Nancy indicated earlier, these statistics are relative to what's going on for real children that we're working with and that you're working with if you're working with populations of children in this area. So let's look at the comorbidity data as associated with our instructional environments. Starting in 2008 up to the end of last year in 2023, we've offered diagnosis intervention for over 28,000 students in our sensory cognitive programs. And we've been tracking the diagnostic and intervention data for students with ADHD along with their learning disabilities. What have we learned? Is it consistent with what we just learned in terms of the national characteristics and the behaviors that go along with these populations? In looking at these 28,000 students, here's a strange paradox. When we, on the intake information that we take in when families bring their children in, we're seeing whether or not there are any prior diagnoses. We're taking a look into that diagnostic protocol. Are there other issues beside their learning profile? Here's the paradox. More often than having children diagnosed with reading problems, the largest category that you see here on a prior diagnosis of children entering Lindamood-Bell is attention deficit disorders, ADHD. 26% of the kids coming in who have learning issues, where the families have expressed learning issues, have attention deficit disorder. More than that, if you look at multiple diagnoses, which includes, of course, attentional factors and learning disabilities and others, 22% have multiple diagnoses, with dyslexia at 21%. What that means, obviously, is that we're dealing with children who have multiple diagnoses all the while we're trying to address their learning profile. If we break that out for that population of children who have ADHD, 26% reported having a diagnosis of ADHD. Of those that you see, when you look at the instructional groups being decoding only, comprehension only, or some combination of the two, you see pretty much an equal split. So what that's saying is across the board in terms of their learning profile, regardless of their reading diagnosis, we're seeing ADHD as being comorbid for these particular categories. Of the 7,000 students, 63% have multiple diagnoses, including ADHD. Again, borrowing a biological term, when we're thinking about things from a genetic standpoint, in genetics, we're looking at phenotypes. In other words, what is the particular profile of a student who has learning issues, has attentional issues, and so forth. By definition, a phenotype is a set of observable characteristics of an individual from an interaction of its genotype, its genetic, as it interacts with the environment, which is epigenetics. It has recently become clear that we've thought traditionally that, well, whatever you've landed on the planet with from a genetic standpoint, that's pretty much what you're living with. The simple answer to that previous notation or thought is that a significant number of genes are simply at birth waiting to be expressed based upon environmental impacts, including, of course, education, including, of course, being able to read. The environment of Lindamood-Bell are customized interventions in sensory cognitive instructional procedures to address, again, transdiagnostically, the specific phenotype, the type of behavior that's expressed in their reading. How's that addressed in terms of their attentional factors? When we analyze the comorbidity on three basic phenotypes that we see, decoding, comprehension, or some combination of both, learning behaviors from which we identify the profile, the phenotype, we use those phenotypes recognizing they're shaped by the inherent cognitive abilities and the external factors such as educational experiences and home literacy environment. What's going on at school? What's going on at home? Do we read to our children? All these environmental factors playing a significant role in how genes are expressed in terms of their learning behavior, not to mention their attentional behaviors. So let's take a look at what happens when we parse out the phenotype for children of those, out of that 28,000 of the children that came in. When we do the diagnostic work, we look at the decoding skills only. What do we find? On a comparative diagnosis, when we look at ADHD kids versus kids who do not have ADHD, there are the distinctions on the numbers of kids. Out of that 28,000, ADHD, not ADHD, 8,300. They're the respective ages, their male-female ratios, the actual numbers on that pie chart. Of note, of the 2,400 and change ADHD students who received instruction for decoding, 53% of those students also had a prior diagnosis of dyslexia. So here we are with even a more complex comorbid diagnosis. Instructionally, what happens? There's the breakout. We were able to provide for these kids, seeing a profile that they had of ADHD, in addition to their learning issues. They wound up getting, intensively speaking, 124 hours of instruction versus 108. Students with ADHD had, on average, significantly more instructional hours. What would we hypothesize for the rationale behind that? Clearly, if we take a look at their pre-profile, analysis showed there are statistical differences in the pretest profile of children who have ADHD and those who did not have a prior diagnosis of ADHD. and it was across all measures. When we look at their orthographic processing, their phonemic awareness, word attack, word recognition, accuracy, fluency, their ability to comprehend, and a classic dyslexic kind of profile where you see these kids have extraordinary vocabulary, but their primary dysfunction is in the area of decoding. Sure enough, there were differences between these two profiles. In other words, it's not just a reading issue when we look at the children with ADHD. So from the intervention standpoint, on the first chart there, the ADHD students on their pre and retest percentiles as compared to both, or the children who do not have ADHD, they had statistically significant pre to post growth on all measures. Why is that important? So in spite of having attentional factors, we're able to show that these kids, these individuals, were able to make statistically significant progress in all the measures as associated with their particular reading problem. Of course, you know where I'm going with this. It's the chicken or the egg. If we know that there's a comorbidity issue here, the phenotype of decoding only and also having attentional problems, it's almost a process of elimination approach. They do have issues with regard to reading, so whether or not it's legitimate, whether it's caused by attentional issues or whether or not they have a formative language processing deficit, the issue is to treat it, to address it, to do it intensively with based upon diagnostic processes. If we look at this from an analytical standpoint, even looking at their standard score growth, both populations made large standard score changes on 7 of the 8 measures. Which one we didn't address? You can see it. It was vocabulary. Did we work on vocabulary? Not at all. We didn't need to. If you'll recall, the vocabulary was well above average for both populations. Having addressed decoding issues, what about language comprehension? For those of you familiar with Lindamood-Bell, we parse out our instruction based upon differential diagnosis. We see significant numbers of children not only who fall into the category of decoding issues, but language comprehension as well, or additionally, or exclusively by themselves, which is what this data is exhibiting here. 1,700 children came to us, had no decoding issues, but predominantly they were expressing issues with their ability to comprehend what they read. You're going to see a different profile here. But of that whole population, 6,600 of these children fell into this category of only having comprehension deficits. And let's remember that comprehension is the only reason that we read. Again, ADHD children received more hours of instruction. When we looked at their profiles, on average, they had significantly more instructional hours. And decoding was an issue, but what I'm showing here is when we look at their pre-test profile, as compared to decoding, you can see that their written language comprehension was the primary area of concern. And again, when we looked at the pre-post analysis, the issues that fell into the results, having looked at that, is that the populations had statistically significant pre to post growth on all measures. This is particularly exciting because it's not typically looked at when we're currently thinking about the science of reading and all the things that we should be worrying about decoding. This is interesting data because significant percentages of these kids do not have issues with regard to decoding that falls predominantly into the area of language comprehension. And what was it that we were attempting to address? We weren't concerned predominantly about issues of decoding, accuracy, fluency, and or vocabulary. In spite of that, they made some growth, but our predominant concern was in the area of language comprehension. customized diagnosis, customized intervention. Well, and guess what? There's yet an additional phenotype. There's an additional prognosis because we see a significant number of kids who fall into a category of having issues on both decoding and comprehension. In fact, 7,700 of these kids have issues in the areas, to some extent or another, in both areas. Of the 2,100 students who were previously diagnosed with ADHD and received both symbol imagery and or visualizing and verbalizing instruction, decoding, and language comprehension, 36% of those students also had a dyslexia diagnosis. In other words, 3 comorbid phenotype variables. It gets more and more complicated, but that doesn't take away from the responsibilities of addressing on a customized basis, differentiating from differential diagnosis, differentiating under a prioritized way, customized intervention. For those of you who are parents, this is an important consideration to make sure that you're getting a diagnosis that specifies the nature of these particular diagnostic structures, including attention deficit disorder, but again, cycling back to what the statistics are showing, making sure that you have their learning profile addressed in case there are language processing deficits. There are the hours of intervention. Once again, because of their diagnosis of having ADHD as well, they had significantly more instructional hours. And when we look at the pretest profile, analysis showed differences on some of these measures between these populations, namely in accuracy, fluency, phonemic awareness, and symbol imagery, and word recognition. Why would that be? They had issues both for decoding as well as language comprehension. So diagnostically, when that showed up, the inclination was, in fact, the direction was, the decision was to go ahead and provide instruction in both areas on a prioritized basis. Both ADHD and non-ADHD population had statistically significant pre to post growth on all measures. This is especially exciting because in review, when we take a look at differentiating these phenotypes, these comorbid issues that children are faced with, it's critical that we offer instruction based upon whatever the manifestation is from that transdiagnostic procedure. There, since we were addressing both areas, you can see the large standard score gains across all those measures, including comprehension, word attack, word recognition, accuracy, and so forth. So let's summarize this. ADHD students made statistically significant gains and had more hours of instruction across the 3 general deficit areas, the phenotypes, the categories of decoding, comprehension, and some combination of both. What are the implications? This is ongoing research, and we're taking a careful look at mining into this a little bit more. We think there may be even more additional sensitive ways that we can ferret out a more distinct understanding of some of these phenotypes. So we continue to analyze the data regarding these factors, such as, are there additional behavior issues, which we know go to both categories of attention deficit disorders with or without hyperactivity. And we continue to analyze the environmental influences or the epigenetics. Let me say also that I'm thinking now 30 some plus years, we have recognized that of the environmental factors, let me just sort of categorize this. If the goal is increased learning behavior with or without attentional factors, the 3 variables that we have to control for: differential diagnosis. We cannot provide intervention without understanding the cause or causes of what's contributing to their difficulty. Number two, we have to have differential instruction, customized interventions based on the phenotype, based upon the profile of the student. And number three, and this gets a little more difficult, we have to take seriously the environmental influences on what's going on for our children. That includes, of course, what we know from our previous research, not indicated in this presentation, is that if a child has one or more standard deviation below the age and or mean of their particular profile, think about this. What are the odds if you have an 8th grade student who in public education is 6 years behind in their reading, in an 8th grade classroom with all the content area and everything that's going on, what are the odds, statistically speaking, that you're going to get that child caught up, assuming they have good potential? The odds are almost nil. As compared to, so they're 6 years behind in their reading. Consider the implications for a child, for those of you who are parents, if a child is in 3rd grade and it's impossible for them to be 6 years behind, but they can be 2 years behind. So this chicken or the egg issue is really important from a diagnostic standpoint to understand clearly as early as possible what your child needs, whether or not they have attentional issues, but if they do, are those attentional issues somehow a factor of difficulty in a classroom environment and learning how to read? As we control it, to the extent, think about it this way, to the extent that we can control those variables in the lives of our children, we can affect the change that Nancy was talking about and making sure that we're making a positive change for those children all the way through their independence in learning and their self-regulation, their ability to be dependent as they move on through the educational system. I'll thank you for your time, and if you have information, need additional information, there's our contact information. Feel free to contact me and or any of our centers to address the needs of your children. Thank you very much.